Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video and we're going to talk about boxing and the recent developments regarding the proposed plans for an undisputed heavyweight fight between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury, and those plans being derailed by arbitration from Deontay Wilder reinforcing his rematch clause against Fury after losing his second fight. Now, just to quickly recap over the events leading up to this announcement, we go back to February 2020 when we had the second fight between Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury, and after beating, pretty much destroying Wilder in his second fight, Fury was obliged contractually to fight Wilder for a third time. They tried to make the third fight for December 2020, but of course we were in a post-pandemic climate, and the fight was postponed due to the supposed clash with college football, which in America, as you all know, is very massive and very popular, and the networks didn't want to try and compete with college football because, again, they want to try and maximize the profit and revenue from these fights in terms of the pay-per-view. So that's why that fight was postponed. So most fans presumed that this fight would be rearranged at a certain date. Hopefully, going back then, the pandemic would be rescinded and we can go back to having some sort of crowds and this third fight could go ahead, but that wasn't the case. And after a long period of silence when this fight would be happening overall, fans all of a sudden became far more excited about the prospect of an undisputed fight between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. Now, Anthony Joshua, of course, has 3 of the 4 belts within the division, having the WBA, the WBO and the IBF, and of course Tyson Fury has the WBC version overall. So after months and months of speculation, fans got even more excited when promoter Eddie Hearn recently went to record revealing plans that the fight was going to be staged in Saudi Arabia. We of course know there's a precedence for this because the rematch between Anthony Joshua and Andrew Ruiz was staged there. Other promoters within Team Fury, Bob Arum and Frank Warren, also seemingly confirmed that this fight would take place. So everybody has started to get really excited, and then all of a sudden these plans fell apart because it was revealed that Deontay Wilder had his rematch enforced through a judge decision stating that Fury had to rematch him and that this match had to take place by September the 15th. So a lot of fans were rightly very disappointed because we had seemingly lost out on the very rare occasion of having 2 British heavyweights fight for an undisputed heavyweight champion. Of course, the last time we had this was when Lennox Lewis had managed to achieve that distinction. Many fans were asking, why didn't this happen? How could they have announced the Saudi Arabia fight, knowing full well that the arbitration was still hanging in the background, and why didn't they resolve it before making this future announcement? So a lot of questions by the fans and rightly feeling outraged and disappointed. So we go back to this announcement. Now, when they initially announced the Saudi Arabia fight, I didn't make a video on it because I'm very skeptical in terms of boxing. So many times over the years, we've seen all of these major fights get announced and then they don't actually happen. So I was actually just waiting until literally I saw both fighters making a press conference before I would actually report on it. Because so many often throughout boxing, you get so much fake rumours and speculation, and a lot of it is done to generate traffic, so people have constant things to talk about so they can make more videos and articles and get more clicks and views overall. But I like to wait until something is actually confirmed by all parties involved before running with the story. So that's why I didn't report on it, and now that decision seems certainly validated when we get to this decision overall. So when we look at this overall development, we can really look at it from 3 perspectives in terms of all of the fighters involved. So if we look at Deontay Wilder's position, first of all, he's come under some criticisms, many stating that he's holding up the division, that he's taking away the fight that everybody wants to see. But if we think about it, Deontay Wilder is only reenacting the clause that he's contractually agreed to, right? When Tyson Fury went into the second fight, he signed an agreement that it would be a rematch clause. Now, this is commonplace within all of boxing. When the champion has a voluntary defense, it's normally within a rematch clause. That's standard procedure within boxing. So the challenger knows what they're getting into when they sign a clause. So I don't really see the problem with that. We all knew that was the case. Now, you can bring up the issue about Deontay Wilder taking step-aside money. This has always been the case. This is nothing new. We know this takes place all the time. Now, certain money was offered to Deontay Wilder, but he's refused this. Now, in this aspect, I can actually respect him for doing this because it shows that he actually wants to avenge his loss. We all know it was a pretty devastating battering that he took from Tyson Fury within his second fight, so he could have easily taken the money and just walked away and just let these guys fight. But no, he clearly has a desire to avenge the loss against Fury, so I can respect him for that. Now, there are certain reports that the standalone fee could be anywhere between 10 and 20 million. Now, a lot of people will think that's outlandish, but I think that's going on the basis as to what they would potentially earn from a third fight, and maybe they're taking into account the earnings from the previous two fights between Wilder and Fury, and also maybe they're looking at the potential earnings that AJ and Fury stand to get if they do indeed follow ahead with the fight in Saudi Arabia. But again, we've got no confirmation as to how exactly they're going to calculate that fee. My only thought process on that is that I'm not quite sure a third fight between Wilder and Fury is going to generate the sort of big payout that 10 to 20 million would actually justify, right? Because there's going to be less hype against that fight because many people felt that Fury won both fights already, so it's going to be hard for them to generate the same type of buzz as what they did for the first two fights. So remember, any step aside offer will probably come with the caveat of fighting the winner between AJ and Fury as well. So on the one hand, Deontay Wilder could take the step aside money and then go ahead and fight Fury if Fury does indeed win. But what if Anthony Joshua wins, right? So if Anthony Joshua wins the fight and then Wilder manages to get the winner, then you'll go into a whole different set of negotiations. And remember, this step aside money is really from Team Fury's side, right? The step aside money has nothing to do with Anthony Joshua, Eddie Hearn or Matchroom, because there's nothing from their position that's legally binding in terms of a rematch clause, right? So if, let's say, Anthony Joshua beat Tyson Fury and went into negotiations with Deontay Wilder, then there's a whole different set of terms to be arranged, right? Normally, Anthony Joshua would want a rematch clause for himself just in case he lost against Deontay Wilder. So that's a whole different set of negotiations. So it's not quite as simple when we simply say, well, Wilder can take the step aside money and then fight the winner, because not only has Fury got to agree to those terms, but also Anthony Joshua has got to agree to those terms as well. So that scenario is not quite as simple as what many people I think are trying to make it out to be. So going back to Wilder, he really is in the best position possible. He's essentially got two guaranteed paydays. He's got one guaranteed payday in terms of taking step aside money, and then he's got another guaranteed payday if he manages to fight the winner, and if that in case is Fury as well. Now he could possibly have a third payday if he wants to have an interim match in between Joshua and Fury taking the fight. Now that would actually be quite sensible, because you remember Wilder hasn't fought since February last year, so that's coming on now to nearly 15 months. So it's a bit of a big ask for him to have such a big layoff and then go into a third fight against Fury. Now, when I commented on the match between Wilder and Fury, I said it's a bit unrealistic to ask Deontay Wilder to completely change his game and learn a whole new skill set going into that third fight and really gain the attributes that's what I think he would be required in order to try and beat Tyson Fury in the third fight. So that would actually be very sensible if Deontay Wilder took a fight in between AJ and Fury then fighting in Saudi. A lot of people have mentioned maybe Charles Martin or maybe Andrew Ruiz. I think Charles Martin is a very good pick because that's an opponent that he could beat pretty easily, get some round under his belt. Now, Deontay Wilder may not decide to have an interim fight because, of course, if he takes an interim fight and he loses, then that obviously jeopardizes any rematch or any potential fighting the winner of AJ and Fury as well. So that's another decision. That's probably why Deontay may decide not to take an interim fight and essentially take the step aside money, whether it's 10 million or 20 million, and just wait to see what happens between the winner, between AJ and Fury. So yes, Deontay Wilder at the moment, if we look at the position of all three fighters, he's certainly the guy that's in the best position overall. So when we look at Tyson Fury, now I think in terms of why this Undisputed fight may not happen now, we really have to look at Team Fury as being the culpable ones in terms of why this fight isn't happening, because they were the people who knew all along about this potential arbitration case. We all know that the rematch was there to be fought, of course. Really, when Eddie Hearn comes to them with the offer in Saudi, they shouldn't have talked to Eddie Hearn at all. They should have said, look, we can't make any decision about the Saudi fight right now because we've still got this rematch clause and we've got a potential arbitration case happening, because according to various reports, this judge hearing has been ongoing since the beginning of this year. So they knew that that was dangling over them. So they really didn't have any right to try and negotiate another fight when this issue was still hanging in the balance, right? So I think that's poor decision making. Again, if you go by recent interviews from both Bob Arum and Frank Warren, they were very confident that the judge's decision would go in their favour, but there's still that lingering doubt. Whether it was a 70-30% chance or a 90-10% chance, there was still a small possibility that the judge could have ruled in Deontay Wilder's favour. So they should never have gone into negotiations with Eddie Hearn about the Saudi fight in the first place. Now, in all fairness, they did try to make the fight, and if we were in a normal climate without this pandemic, I firmly believe that the third fight would have taken place between Fury and Wilder. Maybe if not December, then shortly after, the following year in 2021. So we could give him a bit of leeway on that front, but as I mentioned before, they should never have really negotiated the fight in the first place with Eddie Hearn. Now, Eddie Hearn, as we all know, likes to be in front of a camera, likes to give so many multiple interviews, and I think after a while it got to this point when Eddie Hearn, I think, was a bit impatient and he tried to force the negotiations through, because you have to remember, from his point of view, he can't have Joshua waiting in the background too long. He wants to keep him active again, and with holding 3 belts, of course, all the mandatories are going to come up very shortly. So I think Eddie Hearn tried to force the hand. He went out on public record saying that the fight was done, and then he really left it over to both Frank Warren and Bob Arum to say if the fight wasn't going to go ahead, then they can be the ones that can go on record and explain to the public why the fight wasn't going ahead in place. So I think that was very much of a forceful initiative from Eddie Hearn. But clearly, of course, all of their heads were turned by the massive financial payment from the Saudi Arabia fight. So they got a bit greedy, I think. But again, it's just poor planning and poor anticipation in terms of Team Fury. But when we look at Tyson Fury himself, now, what can he do about this? So he clearly wants to fight against Joshua because, of course, of the money and also because of the chance to become undisputed champion. So it's very much of a legacy fight for Tyson Fury, right? So if he manages to pull off this fight and he beats AJ, he can turn around and say, right, well, I beat the lineal champion in Vladimir Klitschko. I then beat the long-time unbeaten champion Deontay Wilder in his own backyard, and then I went on to become the undisputed champion by beating the most popular pay-per-view heavyweight in Anthony Joshua. So at this stage, I've beaten all of the main contenders. What else do I need to do? Right? So he clearly is looking at this fight, I believe, as a final retirement package. I think if he does make this fight and he goes to beat Anthony Joshua, then I think he'll retire from the sport after that. So if that doesn't go ahead, then of course he'll have to follow through with the rematch against Wilder. We're now seeing, especially with the Canelo and Billy Joe Saunders fight, that we can have now large crowds finally at stadiums, so they'll be able to make that fight no problem. It will still be a big payday for Fury. Now, of course, the caveat to that is that it's a potential risk because, as we all know, despite the fact how the second fight went between the two, Deontay Wilder is still a very dangerous puncher. He can turn fights around with literally one punch. We saw that with the 2 Ortiz fights, and of course we saw that with the first fight against Fury as well. So that's a potential risk that Tyson Fury is looking at. If he takes the rematch, then he could potentially lose the chance to fight Anthony Joshua in Saudi Arabia. Not only that, if he chooses to go ahead of the rematch, then I firmly believe that Joshua will end up vacating very least the WBO belt, because as we all know, Alexander Usyk is his mandatory, and I think what will happen is Joshua will start dropping the WBO belt, and then Alexander Usyk can fight Joe Joyce for that belt. So the chance to fight for the undisputed fight is then lost as well on Fury's perspective. Now, Fury could simply put out the fight citing an injury, but even then I'm pretty sure he'll still have to pay some form of compensation against Wilder. So he's got two options really. He can offer to pay him step aside money, he can pull out the fight, but either scenario he still has to pay Deontay Wilder some form of compensation. So he's better off going ahead with the rematch, beating Deontay Wilder again, and then he can then free himself of that option as well. Another thing to consider also is that even if he has the rematch with Deontay Wilder and he beats him, he then himself will have a mandatory against Dillian Whyte, who, as we all know, has been waiting 1,000 odd days for his shot. So that's another potential obstacle in terms of hindering the Undisputed fight. So there's all these different avenues, but I think in general, what will happen is that Fury, I think, will rematch Wilder. I think that's the best way to kind of get the issue done, get it out of the way. You've beaten him once. Many people feel you beat him twice. So you should be super confident going to that third fight. Essentially just adopt the same tactics that you did for the second fight. Get it out of the way, and then you free yourself with more options going forward. So that's what I think will happen. Now we look in terms of Joshua's position, and he really is in a neutral stance, because if this fight doesn't happen, then fair enough, he still keeps his 3 belts. He can go ahead and still have big massive fights, especially in the UK. As you all know, he's a massive popular name. He is, after Canelo, I think, the biggest pay-per-view star within boxing. And like Canelo, he can literally fight any opponent at any time and still generate massive numbers. So it doesn't really affect Joshua too much. He's very rich and wealthy anyway, so okay, he'll miss the opportunity, but that's not too much of a disappointment, because like I said, he can have multiple fights and still earn loads of money. So it doesn't really put Joshua in too much of a negative position, and I think he's been very smart. He hasn't made any statements within the press. He's just gone away about his business and his training. I think, again, the reason why Eddie Hearn forced this issue is because he didn't want Joshua to just be sitting there waiting for Team Fury to get their house in order. So Joshua could just move on and carry on. As I mentioned before, I really think he'll vacate the belt. A lot of people are stating that he'll go straight away into a fight with Usyk. I don't think so, because I think the plan from Eddie Hearn is that they want to build up Usyk as a heavyweight contender, because think about it, he's had 2 fights and he hasn't really looked convincing in either. The most recent one, of course, was against Derek Chisora, and he won that on the points decision. Yes, he was the deserved winner, but he didn't destroy Chisora, he didn't batter Chisora, right? So he did very little to convince many people that he could actually beat Joshua, Wilder or Fury. And I think the problem is Usyk is just too small. In comparison, in terms of the heavyweights, yes, of course, when you look at the big 3, they are very big heavyweights in terms of their height and their build. And Usyk is just too small of a man by comparison. And I think he really needs to get a couple of more fights within the division, get used to it, get to the point where he can actually score a couple of big knockouts and really make a imposing physicality in terms of these fights against these bigger heavyweights. So I think people are getting a bit carried away in terms of Usyk. I think if he fought Joshua right now, I think Joshua would stop him maybe in a later round. So they don't want to push that button yet. What they want to do is have Joshua vacate the WBO belt, have Usyk fight Joe Joyce, and then you can have a couple of fights with Usyk, just establish himself as a major heavyweight contender. Joshua can have a couple of fights as well, and then they can build up that super unification fight between Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk, and that'll be easy, of course, because they're both under the Matchroom Design banner. So that'll be in the same house, no problem with that fight overall. That's what I think is going to happen. I don't think he'll go into a fight with Usyk overall. He'll have other mandatories of his other remaining belts that he's got, so he can take the fights in the short term overall. So no problem in terms of Joshua or Eddie Hearn in terms when we talk about this overall issue. So unfortunately, again, we're just going through the disappointment of not getting to see an undisputed fight between the 2 heavyweights. I think it's a shame overall. Now, of course, this could change. Maybe they really give Wilder a massive offer that he simply can't refuse. But my thinking is that I really think it's not about money from Deontay Wilder. I think he wants to avenge that Tyson Fury loss above anything else. And again, he really is controlling the narrative. So sad to say, I don't think we're going to get this undisputed fight, because if it doesn't happen now, which is the best opportunity, then eventually what will happen is the belts will get split up and they'll go to various fighters, and it will be many years before we get the chance to get an undisputed fight overall. So again, it's very sad, but this is boxing, and this is why, as I mentioned at the start of this video, I don't cover it as much as many people do, because we've seen this happen so many times. And again, it's all about greed and pride and ego and status, and as a result, the fans lose, because the fans want to see an undisputed champion. And let's face it, even if we did get an undisputed champion, it wouldn't last very long. Particularly, I think, if Fury won the fight, because again, they'll have all of these mandatories, whether against Dillian Whyte, whether against Alexander Usyk. And fighters don't want that. They don't want to have to be controlled by the sanctioning bodies. They want to be able to fight who they want, when they want, how they want, and make the fights that are most lucrative rather than the fights that the fans want to see. That's been an ongoing problem for many years now throughout the sport. And it's not just Joshua and Fury. You know, Canelo is a big culprit of this as well when it comes to picking and choosing who you fight as well. So yep, it's just a shame overall. We're not going to get undisputed, I don't think. I mean, we wait and see what happens. You know, things can change all the time in boxing, but I just think it highlights again why boxing is really just this chaotic and crazy sport. And this is what happens when you have too many people involved who are able to control the narrative and have all sorts of legal loopholes that they can use to gain for their own initiative. And I've said multiple times, until you have an independent regulator that can come into the sport and set clear parameters and clear guidelines, and not have the individuals allowed to control the narrative, then this is what you're going to get. So that's what I think will happen. I think Fury will take the rematch against Wilder. I think AJ will drop the WBO belt. Alexander Usyk will become WBO champion. And then further down the line, I think Anthony Joshua will fight Alexander Usyk. And further down the line, I think Fury will fight Dillian Whyte, if he decides to indeed stay in the game after fighting against Wilder. Who knows, he may retire from the game as well. So that's what I think will happen in the short term. Unfortunately, we won't get an undisputed champion in the heavyweight division, which is what boxing needs as well. So it's a very shame, but this is boxing. This is the way the sport is run. We'll see what will happen in the long run. If we get further announcements, then I will provide a video update as well on this. But those are my thoughts on this issue regarding Deontay Wilder and his arbitration preventing the undisputed fight between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think this is another indication of how boxing is and how it really needs to sort itself out? We've known this has been an ongoing issue for decades now. Or do you think there is a way around this? Do you think they will come to some form of settlement when Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury can fight for the undisputed heavyweight championship in August this year? So let me know what you think in the comments below. Please also hit those like and subscription buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.